My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I'm 67 years old, a retired school teacher, and a widow of 3 winters. I keep my life simple. A good cup of Darjeeling, the weight of a handwritten letter in my hands, and silence. Not the empty kind, but the kind that lets you hear your own breath when the world tries to talk over you. I have a habit. Every Friday morning at 8:15, I walk down Sycamore Lane to Whitfield's Market. I buy a dozen eggs, 1 can of crushed tomatoes, and a Powerball ticket. I always choose the same numbers. I always sign my name on the back. Then I fold it neatly into fourths and tuck it behind my late husband Harold's old library card in my wallet. It's a quiet routine, almost a prayer. It keeps me steady. But on a Tuesday morning, when I learned those numbers had hit for a jackpot of $53 million, I didn't hear it from the news or from the clerk who usually winks and says, "Maybe this week, Mrs. Whitmore." I found out because my daughter-in-law shoved her phone into my face and told me to pack my things. I was in the kitchen, steeping tea in Harold's favorite blue porcelain cup, the one with a faint crack down the side. I had just set the saucer onto the counter when Marissa burst in, breathless, her phone trembling in her hand. Her nail polish was chipped. Her smile wasn't. She turned the glowing screen toward me. $53 million, bold white letters, red confetti, exploding like a celebration, like a bomb in the quietest house on Sycamore Lane. Her voice was sharp, rehearsed, cutting. "We don't need your pension anymore, Eleanor." Behind her, my son Daniel leaned against the hallway wall with his hands in his pockets, the same stance he used as a boy when he'd broken a neighbor's window. Guilty, unsure, already drifting away from me toward something heavier than his conscience. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Marissa went on, words like locks clicking into place. "You've been here long enough. You've had a nice stay, but this house isn't meant for 3. You understand?" I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or throw the tea. I didn't ask why they thought it was right to cast out a mother from her own bloodline. Instead, I lifted the cup with both hands, careful not to spill, and whispered, to the room more than to them, "Did either of you check whose name is printed on that ticket?" The silence that followed was instant, heavy, like someone had opened a freezer door in July. Marissa blinked. Daniel glanced at her, then at me, then back again. She lowered her phone. He opened the drawer where I always kept my wallet, found it, unfolded the ticket, creased into fourths, like always. My handwriting stared back at him in steady blue ink. Eleanor J. Whitmore. His lips moved, but no words came out. Marissa's face froze, like someone had pressed pause on her. I set my cup down slowly so it wouldn't rattle, and in that moment, I made a decision. Not out of rage, not out of revenge, but out of something quieter and deeper. A line had been crossed. I left the kitchen without another word, letting them sit with the proof of their mistake. Proof that I was no liability, no burden. I was leverage, and I wasn't going to be used again. Let them hear the echo of their own words in a house they thought wasn't mine. In a family I once believed I belonged to. They had already spent the money in their minds. But the name they never thought to look at, was mine. And that name carried choices, consequences. I didn't leave that day. Not yet. Instead, I brewed myself another cup of tea and sat in the sunroom where the light still reached me after noon. They stayed in the kitchen, whispering, pacing, calculating. I didn't rejoin them. I didn't need to. I already knew the arithmetic they'd been working through in their heads for years. And I, Eleanor Whitmore, 67 years old, widow of Harold Whitmore, mother to a son who had my eyes but not my backbone, was still here, still steady, still mine, even if they had quietly forgotten. 3 years ago, when Harold passed, I lost more than a husband. I lost the rhythm of my days, the garden we'd tended side by side, the morning crossword banter, the knowing glances over church coffee. I lost the man who used to fill the space between my thoughts. And then, just as the grief had begun to harden like concrete, they came with the suggestion, "You shouldn't be alone in that house, Mom. It's not safe anymore. We've got a room, and we'd love to have you." So, I said yes. I packed up my wedding china, wrapped each piece in the pages of a novel I no longer had the strength to finish, and walked away from the home I had built with 43 years of quiet loyalty. I took only what I could carry of myself, a few cookbooks, a folded quilt, Harold's library card, and the photo of us taken in 1983, before the gray, before the forgetting. The first night in Daniel and Marissa's guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the pale blue walls and their matching throw pillows, and a sharp truth cut through me. I was a guest in my own bloodline. The house smelled of lavender and citrus, not wood polish and coffee grounds. Their voices moved too quickly. Their laughter never touched their eyes. The photographs on the hallway walls looked curated, not lived in. There were no smudged fingerprints at the corners. That Friday, like every Friday, I walked to Whitfield's Market. Young Noah Whitfield, son of the original Mr. Whitfield, was behind the counter, straightening gum packs when I came in. He looked up with a smile. "Same numbers, Mrs. Whitmore. Always. Don't forget to sign it." Wouldn't dream of it. He slid me a pen, and I signed my name the way I had for 3 decades. Full name, cursive, neat, a little slant to the right, the way Harold used to tease me about. I folded the ticket into fourths, opened the back of my wallet, and slipped it behind the library card Harold had carried since 1976. He loved that card more than his driver's license. Even when he forgot his keys, he never forgot that card. "The day I lose this," he used to say, "is the day I stop being curious. Now I carry it because I don't want to forget what it felt like to be needed, to be a part of someone else's learning." On the sidewalk outside the market, I looked up at the cold sky and whispered, "Still here, Harold. Still walking the same streets. Still signing that name, folding that ticket like a small hope, and still carrying you." When I returned to Daniel's house, though my name had once helped co-sign it, I placed the ticket gently in my drawer between cookbook tabs and a safety pin I never used. That evening, I heard Marissa on the phone, her voice carrying through the hall, complaining about wine subscriptions and the burden of squeezing elder care between yoga and emails. I didn't answer. I just sat by the window with Harold's card in one hand and the ticket in the other. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked in its stubborn rhythm. No one came to check on me. No one asked how my walk had been, and I realized something brutal and simple. I was still here, but I had become invisible. So I folded the card back into my wallet, tucked the ticket behind it again, and whispered into the evening air, "You'll see me soon enough." Every morning after that, I woke to the soft creak of the floorboard near the stairwell, careful not to wake anyone else. The guest room they gave me didn't even have a real lock, just a sliding latch, the kind you'd use for a garden shed. I told myself it was temporary. Everything felt temporary. I cooked breakfast before the sun rose. Marissa liked oat milk in her coffee. Daniel wanted his eggs over medium, not too runny, with turkey bacon. Little Mia hated crusts on her toast. I remembered it all. I folded laundry with practiced hands. I pushed the grocery cart through Hensley Market, clipping coupons, calculating every cent. But no one ever said thank you. Not once. The living room, they called it that. But it was only a room where they lived. For me, it was something else entirely. It was where I sat in silence, carrying Harold, carrying myself, waiting for the day they'd finally notice what they had chosen not to see. To me, it was never really a living room. It was a hallway, a transition space. I didn't belong to the furniture, to the frames on the walls, to the thick cream rug where Mia scattered her dolls. I wasn't part of the family photos they took last Christmas. I stood off by the kitchen counter while they smiled in front of the tree. One Thursday afternoon, Marissa came home early from her office job. She carried a manila folder and an air of management. She placed it on the table where I was peeling. "Carrots. Eleanor," she said without looking at me. Daniel and I thought it'd be helpful to clarify things, financially speaking. I dried my hands on my apron as she opened the folder. A spreadsheet lay inside, carefully color-coded with her trademark yellow highlighter. My name was printed at the top. Beneath it was a breakdown. Utilities, $136.47. Food, $210. Household. Supplies, $57.89. Entertainment, shared streaming accounts, $12.99. Total, $417.35. She tapped the bottom cell. We rounded it down to an even $400. That way it's easier for budgeting. It's fair. You live here too. I stared at the page. The total matched my monthly pension deposit, down to the cent. Not a dollar left untouched. Daniel walked in, from the garage, wiping his hands with a rag. "It's not a big deal, Mom. I mean, come on. You eat here, you use the water, the electricity. It's not like we're charging you rent." I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I didn't trust my voice. Inside, something tore. Not loud like glass shattering, but soft, like fabric giving way, worn too thin to hold anymore. I went back to peeling carrots. That night, I sat alone in the hallway with the yellow highlighted sheet on my lap while the sound of a sitcom laugh track spilled from the living room. My fingers touched the edge of the paper. It was warm from my skin. That shade of yellow, so bright and unfeeling, had been chosen to represent my place in their home. A color meant for notes and disclaimers. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a calculation. And when love is measured with numbers, it stops being love. The chandelier in the dining room was far too grand for a house that lacked warmth. Marissa loved to entertain. Hedge fund managers, tech executives, a woman whose diamonds glittered so sharply it looked like they could cut the air itself. I stood in the kitchen behind the swinging door, polishing wine glasses with the precision of someone who once kept her own household running. Harold used to joke that I could tell a person's feelings by the way they held a glass. Firm and high, they were bluffing. Loose and low, they were listening. Clutched tightly, they were nervous. Now I held each one like a memory. Crystal stemmed, delicate, more delicate than the way they treated me. Laughter rang out from the dining room. That polished, expensive laughter of people who toasted without meeting each other's eyes, the kind that filled every corner of a room but left no space for truth. I had just rinsed a set of red wine goblets when I heard it. It's like having a live-in maid who pays you rent. One voice chuckled. then another, and then the laughter swelled, careless, unashamed. Marissa's voice followed, amused, complicit. Well, technically she does live here rent-free, but Daniel thought it was only fair she contribute to the household expenses. I froze, glass in hand. I wasn't surprised. Not really. But the word, maid, landed deep, like they had finally found the wound they'd been pressing toward all along. A maid. I once sat beside Daniel at this very table, coaxing him through multiplication tables with flashcards and peanut butter crackers, when he cried over long division. I once patched his soccer socks before every game because we couldn't afford new ones, and he hated the scratch of holes. I once taught him how to write thank you notes, of all things. Now I was a maid who paid rent, a punchline, a utility wrapped in skin. They used to call me Mom. Not out of obligation, but with the kind of trust that said I was their anchor, their audience, their forgiver. I set the glass on the towel and picked up the next. Steam still rose. From the sink. My hands moved out of habit, not thought. I tapped the rim of the glass lightly with my fingernail, rhythmically, like a heartbeat only I could hear. Tap, tap, tap. A soft, dull clink that only Eleanor Whitmore could hear beneath the echo of voices spilling from the dining room. It was almost musical, a rhythm she kept for herself, a quiet metronome to steady the ache in her chest. Maybe this was how women disappeared, not in an instant, but in layers. First, their names became shorter. Then their stories were dismissed as repetitive. Their warnings were rebranded as nagging, their generosity as debt, and eventually, their very presence faded into invisibility. From behind the kitchen door, she caught the sound of laughter, then the bright clinking of raised glasses. They were toasting something. Eleanor could picture the long table, set with candles, handmade menus, and name cards in Marissa's tidy calligraphy. Marissa adored details like that, gestures that looked like depth but cost nothing real. Eleanor's name wasn't on any of those cards. It wasn't spoken in reverence or remembrance, not even as a passing courtesy. Forgotten or worse, turned into a punchline. For a moment, she imagined walking in, her voice cutting through their cheer just to remind them she still existed. But she didn't. Instead, she polished another glass. Tap, tap, tap. Sometimes dignity isn't loud. Sometimes it's not a speech or a slammed door. Sometimes it's the decision not to let bitterness take root, to keep doing the small, steady things that hold you together, even when no one is watching. She placed the last glass neatly with its siblings, gleaming like soldiers in formation. In the reflection, she saw herself, older, weathered, tired, but undeniably still herself. They might try to rewrite her role in this house, but they hadn't erased her. If they were determined to make her invisible, then she would learn how to vanish on her own terms. And when she did, she would not leave empty-handed. Later, after her evening walk, she came back to find them at the dining table again. This time there were no plates, no wine glasses, just blueprints spread wide across the polished wood. They weren't scribbled ideas. These were printed in color, stapled neatly, laminated even. This wasn't a brainstorm. It was a presentation. Marissa looked up with a bright smile, gesturing Eleanor over as though introducing a guest of honor. "We've been working on something that we think you'll love." Daniel added a smile of his own, the shallow kind he used when he thought he was being clever. We thought it's time you had your own space, with privacy. Marissa unfurled a trifold board, polished and precise like a school project. On it was the design of a room, a narrow space tucked beneath the basement staircase. One single bed, a small corner sink, a curtain in place of a door. And at the bottom, a line item. Estimated cost, $1,730. Basic finishes. Marissa tapped the glossy rendering with her pink French tip nail. See? Cozy, minimalist, clean. You won't have to tiptoe around us anymore. Eleanor studied the design. The lines were sharp, precise, labeled in neat font. Bed, lamp, power outlet. But what wasn't labeled screamed louder. Bare concrete walls. A slit of a window that wouldn't open. No closet. No warmth. The word privacy stood bold at the top, but Eleanor saw only confinement. Privacy doesn't come from how deep underground you bury someone, she said quietly. It comes from how much you respect them above ground. Silence followed. Daniel shifted in his chair. Marissa's eyes flickered, but her smile stayed fixed, like a realtor refusing to drop the price. Eleanor didn't raise her voice, didn't shed a tear. Instead, she reached out and rested her finger on the corner of the page where it read, PVC plumbing optional, budget concerns. And there it was. The truth behind their effort. This wasn't about helping her. It was about containing her. Tucking her out of sight like clutter. Marissa finally broke the silence. We thought you might appreciate not having to sleep in the living room anymore. Eleanor smiled faintly. And here I thought the living room was temporary. The words hung heavy in the air. No one spoke. She turned toward the window and stood there, gazing at the dark street outside. Porch lights flickered on across the neighborhood, scattering soft yellow light across the sidewalk. She used to believe light made a home warm, but now she knew better. It wasn't the glow. It was the way people spoke to you inside it. Behind her, she heard the shuffle of papers, being gathered, blueprints stacked with care, their proud little project being tidied away. To them, it was a gift. But Eleanor knew better. It was a blueprint for erasure. She didn't protest. She didn't plead. She simply kept staring into the night, letting them wonder what part of her they had just tried to bury under their $1,730 plan. Every Thursday afternoon, Eleanor Whitmore walked the 4 blocks to McKinley's corner store. It was less an errand than a ritual, not born of desperation but of remembrance, and perhaps a quiet, stubborn hope. Liam, the young cashier, always greeted her with a polite nod. He never asked questions, never filled the air with small talk. That silence was a kindness she treasured more than he could ever understand. The smell of worn linoleum, the faint hum of the refrigerator near the back. These small constants steadied her. She stepped to the counter, asked, "Can I get my usual?" And Liam handed her the slip. 5 numbers, the same ones she had chosen years ago. They never changed. On her way home, the breeze carried a crispness, like the page of a new chapter being turned. She paused by the elm tree on the 2nd block. Right there, Daniel had once fallen from his bike, skinning his knee. She remembered crouching down, wrapping a bandage while he sobbed, "You're the best, Mom." That memory, once warm, now pressed, heavy against her ribs. At the crosswalk, she slowed and lifted the lottery ticket, holding it like one might hold a pressed flower, fragile, tucked away from the world. Her eyes traced each number, 14. Her wedding day. Harold in his one good navy suit, her in her mother's pearls. They didn't have much, but they had promise. 7. Daniel's birthday. The year he asked her why the sky was blue, why pancakes couldn't be dinner every night. 23. The day Harold had proposed, the night he carved their initials into the oak bench at Forest and Lake. 31. The house number of their first home, where Daniel lost his first tooth on the porch. 12. The month Harold died, the month she learned how to keep living without collapsing. To anyone else, they were just numbers. To Eleanor, they were stitched through her life, beats of memory, pulses of love, proof of a life once shared. She smiled faintly, not with amusement, but with clarity. Maybe it was time those numbers spoke for her. She had whispered through life long enough. When she entered the house through the back kitchen door, she moved carefully, not letting the hinges creak. It was quiet. Marissa had taken the children to gymnastics. Daniel was still at work. Eleanor stood in the dining room a moment too long, staring at the framed photographs lined neatly on the shelves. Not one of them included her. It had stung once. Now it only informed. She opened her purse, slid out her worn wallet, and pulled a faded photo from its hidden flap. Her wedding day. Harold's glasses caught the light, his eyes alive with a sparkle that still ached to remember. She looked so young in the picture she barely recognized herself. Turning the photo over, she taped the ticket to the back. Then, carefully, she tucked it behind the lining of her wallet, the same secret pocket where the photo had lived since Harold's passing. It felt like a vault the world could not touch. At the kitchen table, she let her ring brush the edge, making the softest clink. Not the original. Her fingers had grown too swollen with arthritis for that, but it still carried Harold's promise. Closing her eyes, she breathed. Those numbers weren't guesses. They weren't random. They were markers of a life, chapters of love and loss, of promises once spoken aloud. If no one else in this house remembered them, then maybe they would learn, one way or another. That evening, the house was hushed. Eleanor folded one of Daniel's shirts in the laundry room, smoothing the creases just as she always had. Habit, not devotion. The dryer had just clicked off when the murmur of the television drifted from the living room. She hadn't turned it on. Must be the timer, she muttered, wiping her hands on a towel. She stepped into the room, the shirt still in her hands. The screen glowed with a polished anchor's smile, too bright, too rehearsed. And now, the winning numbers for tonight's Powerball. Eleanor froze. Her breath caught. Not in excitement. Not yet. Just a flicker of recognition, like stumbling onto a page she hadn't meant to turn to. 14, the anchor announced. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the shirt. 7. Her throat went dry. 23. Eleanor felt the room grow quieter, not because the television dimmed, but because her mind stopped measuring time in its usual rhythm. Seconds stretched, warped like heat waves shimmering above asphalt. She crossed to the small table by the eye, doctor where her purse still sat. Her hands moved calmly, with a strange precision that surprised her. They knew exactly what to do. She pulled out her wallet, fingers working their way to the secret flap behind the faded photograph of her wedding day. Harold's tie had been crooked in that picture. She'd teased him about it once, and he had only laughed, saying he never noticed. She always loved that about him. There it was, the lottery ticket, folded neatly where it had been hidden all along. Eleanor held it as though it were both fragile and indestructible, a slip of paper suddenly heavy with meaning. She flipped it over. 14, 7, 23. Her eyes moved down the line. Her breath caught with each number the anchor read. Aloud. 31, 12. Each one matched. Every digit, every milestone, every memory. Like stepping stones across a river she had never believed she could cross. Her hands trembled, not violently, not out of fear, but with something she hadn't felt in years. Release. The anchor's voice faded into scripted pleasantries, the studio lights gleaming behind her. Eleanor didn't hear the rest. She didn't need to. She walked to the television, remote in hand, and turned it off. Silence filled the room again. She didn't scream. She didn't dance. She lowered herself onto the couch, its cushions still, marked with the impression of a grandchild who had bounced there earlier. The porch light filtered weakly through the curtains, casting a pale glow over the numbers in her lap. She traced each one with her thumb, not to verify but to honor. "Harold," she whispered, just loud enough for the empty room to hear. "You'd love this part." The air seemed warmer, not because of the money, but because she knew she wouldn't have to explain it to him. He would have chuckled, pulled her close, and said something like, "Told you those numbers were lucky." But Harold was gone. So she sat alone, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel lonely. She felt ready. There were no shouts of victory, no champagne, no frantic calls to news stations, just stillness, steady and vast. She stood after a few minutes, reached for her phone, her hands still trembling with the weight of what had just happened. She called only 2 people. The first was Miriam Cole. Miriam had been Harold's colleague for years, an estate attorney with a sharp wit, a warm laugh, and a loyalty that had somehow outlived the man himself. After Harold died, Eleanor and Miriam had drifted, not out of conflict, but because grief has a way of scattering the familiar. The number hadn't changed. Miriam answered on the second ring. "Eleanor?" she said, her voice a mix of surprise and delight. "It's been a while," Eleanor replied, "but I could use a favor." A pause. Then Miriam's voice softened. "I always knew you'd call. Again, sooner or later." "I need to talk about estate protections," Eleanor said evenly. "And I need it handled discreetly." "Eleanor," Miriam repeated, slower this time, sensing something underneath. "Are you all right?" "I think," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "I just won the lottery." There was silence, then the sound of Miriam drawing in a breath. "Then I think we have some things to secure. I'll bring the paperwork." Eleanor didn't need to explain further. Miriam understood. She always had. The second person Eleanor called was Noah, the grocer who ran the tiny corner mart 2 blocks away. His was the kind of shop that still kept handwritten tabs, still knew the names of widows who bought milk and bread every Tuesday, and never asked why someone always played the same numbers. The phone rang once before he answered, his voice booming cheerfully. "Big Winner Grocery, where your luck turns weekly." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Noah, it's me, Eleanor Whitmore." There was a pause, then recognition. "Well, hey there, Miss Eleanor. You want me to set aside your usual?" "No, not today." She hesitated. "I just need to ask you something." "Shoot." "Last Thursday morning," she said carefully, "I bought my ticket at your counter. Do you remember that?" "Of course I do," Noah said without a beat. "You signed it right after you paid. Pen ran out, remember? I gave you my lucky one." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. "So you saw me sign it?" "I watched you," he said firmly. Front and back, same as always. Right under the numbers, across the top. You've been doing that for years. And you'd be willing to say that in writing? Noah chuckled, his voice warm. For you, Miss Eleanor? You kidding me? You raised half the kids on this block. I'd sign it in stone if I had to. If this was about what I thought it was, you bet I'd put it in writing. I didn't cry. But something in my chest shifted just a little. That warm ache again. The one that reminds you you're not invisible. Not entirely. Noah promised to meet Miriam and me the next morning to sign an affidavit. He even offered to bring some fresh peaches from his cousin's farm. I told him that would be lovely. After we hung up, I took a deep breath and looked out the window. The street was quiet. The roses Harold and I had planted decades ago were blooming again. Deep red, thick-petaled, stubborn in their survival. The same ones I used to trim with Daniel when he was only 5. I sat down at the kitchen table with a blank notepad. Miriam arrived at 9 sharp the next day, briefcase in hand, her eyes wide with something between disbelief and admiration. After our hug, she said gently, I've seen people win, Eleanor, but I've never seen someone carry it like you are. I handed her the lottery ticket from where I'd hidden it, tucked behind the faded wedding photo in my wallet. Her eyes scanned it, her lips parting in quiet awe. She looked at me. Eleanor, it's real. This is life-changing. No, I said softly. It's life-confirming. Her smile faltered for just a second before she gathered herself. We'll get everything transferred into your name. The trust, the ticket, the estate structure. You have nothing to prove to anyone. No, I repeated. But I do have something to reclaim. Later that morning, Noah came in, still wearing his store apron. I welcomed him with tea and warm biscuits. He signed the affidavit in front of Miriam without hesitation, then looked me in the eye and said, They're going to come for this, the ones who forgot you, but now it's your name on that ticket, not theirs. He didn't need to say more. That was the moment the shift became real. Not in the numbers or the paper or the bank account, but in the energy of it all. They thought I was a relic, a weight, an old woman tucked away. But now everything was under my name. And they didn't even know it yet. The morning light filtered through the sheer kitchen curtains the way it always did. Soft, forgiving, pretending not to notice the tension thick in the air. I stood by the sink, rinsing the last of my teacup. From the night before, letting the warm water run a little longer than needed. Through the thin walls I could hear them. Daniel's voice was hushed but firm, just loud enough to carry through the hallway like an unspoken threat. We can move her to Golden Meadows now. It's time. Golden Meadows. The name was too polished, too clean. I knew the place, a retirement. Facility for the well-funded, they claimed. Code for a place you tuck away problems you no longer want to feel responsible for. I wasn't surprised, just disappointed. Marissa responded, her tone sharp with urgency. If we wait too long, she might start thinking she can handle things herself. We need to get ahead of this, before she starts spending the money on who knows what. I dried the teacup gently, slow circles with a towel that had seen better, decades. I placed it on the dish rack and sat at the breakfast table as if it were any other morning. My movements were deliberate, quiet, like a performance no one was watching. And then, the sound of a printer. Marissa had taken to presenting facts lately, as though evidence could replace empathy. A few seconds later, I heard her drop something onto the dining table with a satisfied exhale. This article says 70% of lottery winners go bankrupt. 70. She emphasized it like the number itself was an argument. We're not being cruel, Daniel. We're being practical. I could almost see her tapping the paper with her acrylic nails, highlighting words in yellow, maybe even drawing little arrows next to dramatic quotes about financial ruin. All to make herself feel like the hero in this story. They didn't know I was awake, that I had heard every syllable. I didn't speak. I didn't argue. I didn't storm in with accusations or plead with them to see me. Instead, I reached for the kettle, boiled more water, and made myself another cup of chamomile. The warmth filled the porcelain mug, and I wrapped both hands around it, anchoring myself. Their voices faded into the next room, muffled now by distance, or perhaps by their own delusions of nobility. I sat alone at the breakfast table, staring out the window where the old rose bush still clung to its last bloom. That rose had survived 3 seasons longer than expected. Resilient things often do. I reached for the book resting on the table. Jane Eyre, its spine cracked, the cover worn soft from decades of revisiting. I opened it to the page where I always paused, where Jane chooses herself over comfort. Tucked into that creased margin was the lottery ticket, numbers that meant nothing to anyone else but everything to me. The day I married Harold. The day Daniel was born. The day Harold slipped a ring on my finger and asked me to choose him for life. Marissa saw them as a payout. Daniel saw them as freedom from responsibility. But to me, they were memories etched in ink, cashed in by chance, or maybe by grace. I folded the ticket back into the book and placed it gently in my lap, sipping my tea. I wasn't going to react, today because they had plans. But so did I, and mine were already in motion. I waited until they had settled, coffee in hand, morning paper rustling, their laughter echoing like wind chimes, cheap, hollow, unearned. Daniel scrolled through his phone, feet propped on the ottoman I had crocheted for his first apartment. Marissa stirred almond milk into her coffee with a golden spoon, as if she had earned the morning. As if I hadn't bought every piece of furniture in that kitchen. As if I hadn't wiped Daniel's nose and cooked her anniversary dinners when she forgot to book a caterer. As if I didn't know exactly how many pills I had left each week, because they controlled the refills now. Held the mug steady. Then I said, I think we need to talk about whose name is on that ticket. At first it was quiet. Then Daniel laughed. Mom, what are you even? Marissa chuckled too, that high, sugary tone she used when she wanted something. Oh, sweetie, you're just overwhelmed. It's a lot. We know. I didn't flinch. I took out the ticket, not from a drawer, not from a purse, but from the hollowed pages of The Secret Garden on the bookshelf behind me. Harold had given me that book when we were 19, said I was the only thing in his life that ever bloomed without permission. The room stopped moving. I placed the ticket on the table like a holy object, still warm from my hand, its edges slightly softened. Nothing dramatic, just paper and ink. A moment captured. Marissa blinked, leaned in, and picked it up with 2 fingers like it might bite. She turned it over. There it was, my name, in my handwriting, on the little signature line. I had signed it the same day, like I did every week. Her eyes flicked up, pupils shrinking as though someone had switched on a light inside her skull. She started, her voice too thin to hold air. Daniel leaned forward, grabbing the ticket from her hand. Mom, but you're here. You've been here with us this whole time. I nodded once. Yes, and you've been charging me for it. Rent, meals, medication, transportation. You sent me grocery lists with price tags circled. He flinched. She said nothing. I went on, my voice steady as porcelain. You called me family. Then you turned around and called me a burden. You told the neighbors I was lucky to live in your space. You told the pharmacist I forget things. Daniel looked down. We didn't mean it like that. No, I said. You meant it exactly like that. Marissa straightened her shoulders. We were trying to help you, Eleanor. You were declining. I met her eyes with all the clarity of winter glass. You mean I was no longer convenient? Her mouth opened, then closed again. I leaned back, letting silence do the rest. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't give them what they were, trained to expect from older women who'd been silenced too long. Instead, I picked up my tea, took a sip, and then added, Do either of you remember what else I signed that week? Marissa shook her head. Daniel blinked slowly, still caught between denial and dread. Noah does, I said. Marissa's face twitched. That barista? That witness? Witness, I corrected. Their expressions shifted then, from confusion to recognition to slow, crawling fear. I set the cup down gently. You've been living on borrowed grace, children. You mistook my silence for senility, my stillness for surrender. But I watched, I listened, and I remember. I let that sink in, slow as morning frost. Marissa's voice cracked. So what? Now? You'll take the money and leave us? I smiled, not unkindly. No, Marissa. I'll take back what was always mine, and you'll stay exactly where you are, for now. I folded the ticket back into the secret garden. Daniel's voice was barely audible. Mom? Yes, I said. He swallowed. Did you always know? I stood up, smooth and unshaken. No, I said quietly, but I always hoped. And then I left the room, their silence trailing behind me like a debt unpaid. They stared at the ticket on the table like it was a lit fuse. Daniel's hand twitched. Marissa's breathing turned shallow. We're family, Marissa said, her voice an octave too high, trying to sound soft but cracking under the pressure. This is ours, all of us. You didn't buy that ticket for yourself, right? You live here. You eat our food. You watch our TV. She was unraveling in real time. Daniel cleared his throat, trying to regain some form of control. Mom, you're not seriously planning to keep all $53 million to yourself. That's not who you are. You've always said money should serve family, not divide it. I didn't speak. I looked down at the table, noticing a ring left from someone's glass, probably mine. I reached over and wiped it gently with the edge of my sleeve. The cloth swept across the surface slowly, carefully, as if I were removing not just the stain, but years of expectations. Marissa took a step closer. Eleanor, be reasonable. We're not trying to take from you. We just want to plan this right. We can manage the funds, keep it safe, set up trusts. You know how many lottery winners go broke within a year? She pulled the folded article from earlier out of her pocket and waved it like a legal document. It's not about control. It's about protecting you from yourself, from making mistakes. I looked at her and smiled slightly. She flinched, maybe at how calm I was, or maybe at the sudden realization that none of her old tactics, the patronizing tone, the fake concern, would work anymore. They were still operating in the world before the name on the ticket had been revealed. I stayed quiet. Let the silence settle in. I wanted them to hear it. The absence of begging, the absence of explanation, the absence of guilt. Daniel tried. Again. Mom, look, we can figure this out together. We're not enemies. You're being cold, and that's not like you. No, I wasn't being cold. I was being clean. For decades, I had counted my pennies to make sure they never felt the lack of anything. I clipped coupons, made dinners stretch, bought birthday gifts even when I couldn't afford my own prescriptions. And when their jobs fell through or their bills piled up, I was there, quietly covering what they couldn't. I never asked for repayment. I never brought it up during arguments. I gave and gave and gave, thinking that generosity was love's language. But generosity, without appreciation, isn't kindness. It's servitude. And the thing about servitude is the moment you stop, they don't thank you. They panic, because they thought it was your job to give. I glanced at the ticket on the table, my name printed clearly, still slightly smudged from when I signed it with damp fingers in the market parking lot. I thought of the security guard, who had helped me that day, of the little boy who waved at me while his mother juggled groceries. I thought of the stranger who handed me a bottle of water without asking for anything. None of them knew me. Yet they were kinder to me than the people sitting across this table, the ones who had lived in my womb, my home, my heart. Marissa's voice turned desperate. Eleanor, this isn't how families act. I looked at her with steady eyes. No, I said. This is how people act when they realize the free well is drying up. She opened her mouth to argue, but I gently raised my hand. I don't owe anyone my silence anymore, or my savings, or my skin. I stood and tucked the ticket back into my book, not hiding it, just placing it where I knew it would be respected. As I walked slowly toward the window, I noticed how the morning light caught the edge of the garden outside. The roses had bloomed again. That was the thing about nature. It didn't bloom for who shouted the loudest or who guilted the hardest. It bloomed when it was ready, when it was rooted, just like I was now. Miriam's office was quiet, soft sunlight filtering through the blinds. She didn't speak at first, just handed me a thick envelope, sealed, slightly yellowed at the edges. She placed it on the desk between us with a long sigh and looked me straight in the eye. This is from Harold, she said gently. He left it with me months before he passed. Harold had pressed the envelope into Miriam's hands, saying she should give it to me only if things ever went cold with Daniel. He called it insurance, his way of guarding me in case our boy ever forgot how to be kind. His words. My throat tightened as Miriam slid the envelope across the table. The wax seal looked ordinary, but I already knew it wasn't just paper inside. My fingers trembled as I broke it open. Inside were legal documents, Harold's unmistakable signature looping across the last page. A trust, a dedicated account, $500,000 set aside for me. He had thought of everything: unrestricted access, no co-signers, no oversight. He had even arranged for regular deposits after his passing to keep it alive through inflation or sudden expenses. Miriam's voice softened. He used to say loving someone means building things they might need before they ever ask. I could only nod, unable to trust my voice. Then she handed me a smaller folded note. Harold's handwriting slanted to the left, ink from his fountain. Pen, only one sentence. Don't let them count you out, Eleanor. You were always the sum. The tears came slow, quiet. I saw him in my mind again, at the breakfast table, half laughing as he balanced our checkbook in the morning light. He'd say, "The math only works if you remember the heart behind the key. Numbers?" He muttered it often, especially when Daniel and Marissa came around, needing this or that. He always gave, never complained, but he saw the shift before I admitted it to myself. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my purse. It felt heavier than gold. "You want me to draft a formal notice to Daniel?" Miriam asked. I looked out the window. A golden leaf swayed free from its branch, floating down to the ground. "No," I whispered. "Not yet. Because this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about the money. It was about truth and protection and dignity. All the things Harold knew I'd one day need to hold on to. He hadn't left me behind. He had walked ahead and built me a place to land. So I called for a family meeting. They didn't question why. They assumed, I suppose, that I was ready to cave, to offer them a share, some compromise draped in motherly guilt. Marissa arrived first, striding in with a laptop under her arm and a folder labeled Financial Scenarios, as if she were heading into a corporate merger. Daniel followed with a bottle of red wine and 3 glasses, still leaning on charm as though it could erase months of dismissal. I had already set the room. The lights dimmed to a warm glow. The fireplace flickered, more shadow than comfort. The coffee table between us, neutral ground. On it, a single manila folder. They sat. Marissa flipped open her folder, spilling words about family legacy, strategic generosity, tax efficiency. Daniel poured wine like it was communion. I stayed, silent. I waited. When Marissa finally paused for breath and Daniel slid a glass toward me, I pushed it gently aside. Then I opened the manila folder and laid its contents face up. Spreadsheets, bank records, credit card statements, all highlighted. Harold's final gift, a full financial investigation, conducted months before his passing. Commissioned by him, notarized, sealed, proof of what he had suspected long before. "You're carrying a debt of $97,218, I said evenly. "Most of it accumulated in the last 2 years, Marissa blinked. "That's not correct. Daniel and I manage our finances." "This is from Miriam's firm," I replied, my tone steady. "Commissioned by your father. I opened it 2 days ago." Daniel leaned forward, his face hardening. "That's a violation of privacy." "No," I said softly. "It's a revelation of reality." Silence. The weight of it pressed into the room. I watched as comprehension darkened Marissa's face like storm clouds rolling over a clear sky. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Her hand twitched toward the documents but stopped short. "You've been living," I continued, "on rent, from the garden apartment. Payments Harold and I never charged you for. Miriam routed them quietly when he got sick." Daniel dropped his gaze, anger draining into something else. He wasn't defiant anymore, just exposed. "And when those ran out," I said, my voice steady, "you applied for lines of credit using the house as collateral. You even used my name on one of the applications." Marissa's voice cracked. "We thought you'd left it for us." "You never said," I interrupted quietly, because I was still alive. "Still paying for the roof over your heads, for the utilities, for the food? And all the while, I watched you treat me like a burden while living off my back. No yelling, no theatrics, just the weight of truth, heavy and inevitable." Marissa sat frozen, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Daniel stared at the glass of wine he hadn't touched. The confidence, the casual entitlement, they dissolved slowly, molecule by molecule. I reached forward and closed the folder. "I asked you here not for negotiation," I said, "but for clarity, so that no one confuses love with tolerance again." They didn't speak. What could they say? My eyes lingered on the documents for a moment longer before I stood. "Enjoy your evening," I said softly, and I walked out of the room, leaving behind only the truth. I waited in the hallway until the room had settled again. The clink of wine glasses had faded. Daniel poured himself another, but this time he didn't raise it in toast. Marissa scrolled through her phone as if she could disappear into its glow. Then I returned, carrying a worn blue notebook. I placed it gently on the table. "What's that?" Marissa asked, her voice already sharp with suspicion. "My ledger," I said quietly. "Ledger?" she repeated, as if the word itself offended her. "We're not running a corporate office here." "No," I nodded, still calm. "But for 2 years, I've tracked everything, just to remind myself that I existed in this house." She didn't open it, so I did. Page after page revealed handwritten columns, neat but unadorned. Hours spent watching Emma. Pots of soup made when someone was sick. Early morning school runs in the rain. $312 for Emma's new ballet uniform. When their card declined, $5,480 transferred quietly to cover a missed mortgage payment. Every entry carried a date, a note. No bitterness, just record. You've been keeping a tally? Daniel's voice cracked slightly. I've been keeping perspective, I answered. Marissa scoffed. This is emotional blackmail. I shook my head. No, Marissa. This is emotional accounting. There's a difference. I flipped to a page near the back. Down the center, I had drawn a line. On the left, what I gave. On the right, what I asked. The left column overflowed. The right remained empty. I'm not asking you to pay me back, I said softly. I only want you to understand what it cost me to be invisible in my own family. That's not fair, Marissa said tightly, crossing her arms. Families aren't meant to be measured in dollars and cents. No. I met her eyes without wavering. Then why did you reduce me to rent? Why did you make me pay for your silence with my absence? Her mouth opened, but no words came. Not everything in here is about money, I continued, my hand resting on the ledger. Some things are small, like when I watched Emma for 6 straight days while you both went on that business retreat that turned out to be a cruise. That was a gift, Marissa snapped. No, I said evenly. A gift is something freely given. What I gave was expected, without thanks, without even eye contact. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Daniel turned toward the window, biting at his lip. Marissa blinked quickly, as if the tears she refused to shed might betray her. Finally, I spoke one last line. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear. I kept this record not to demand compensation, but because one day I knew I'd have to remind you. I was part of the equation, not just a variable to be erased. The words hung in the air like breath in a cold room, unanswerable. Inside me, something shifted. The ache was still there, but it was no longer sharp. It came from years of holding back truth in the name of peace. Now, finally, there was room for it. Not because they wanted to listen, but because I no longer asked permission to speak. Later, in my room, I folded the quilt Harold and I had bought in Charleston on our 15th anniversary. Navy blue, stitched with tiny sailboats. It still smelled faintly of cedar and detergent. The house was quiet except for the sound of my suitcase zipper. I placed inside only what I needed, only what couldn't be replaced. My wedding album, the delicate blue china teacup with the chip I'd never minded. Harold's old flannel shirt I wore when the nights felt too empty. And the worn manila envelope holding all the letters he wrote to me during his deployments. I paused, resting my hand on the quilt for a moment before closing the case. Harold had seen this moment long before I did. He hadn't abandoned me. He had built me a way through. And then there was the library card, bent at the corners, its barcode faded from years of use. It was mine, just mine. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding it between my fingers. The morning light slipped through the lace curtains, turning the dust in the air to gold. For a long while, I didn't move. Then I picked up my phone and dialed Noah. He answered on the second ring. Noah, I said, my voice steady. Do you still have the key to Harold's community center room? There was a pause. I do, he said softly. You okay, Eleanor? I smiled, though he couldn't see it. Harold always said I should reopen the senior skills class. I think it's time. Noah chuckled, then said something that settled deep into my ribs. He'd be proud of you. He always said you were the only person who could make people feel seen without making them feel small. I blinked back tears. Well, I whispered, I'm tired of being invisible in my own house. Then maybe it's not your house anymore, Noah replied gently. After we hung up, I moved through the kitchen. I made tea. 1 cup, mine. No one to ask what was for dinner. No one to critique how I folded towels or remind me the thermostat cost money. Just quiet. I didn't slam drawers or stomp or cry. That wasn't my way. I was never loud. But I had learned something. You don't need to raise your voice when you're finally listening to yourself. I looked out at the rose bush Harold had planted the year Daniel was born. One bloom clung stubbornly in the chill of early winter. "Look at you," I whispered, "still showing up." Then I opened every window. The air was crisp, tinged with wood smoke. The breeze tugged the curtains, sunlight pooling across the hardwood floor. For the first time in 3 years, I put music on, Harold's favorite jazz record. The notes filled the rooms like they had been waiting for permission. I didn't know where I was going yet, but I knew what I was leaving. A house that no longer echoed with laughter. A son who treated me like a debit card. A daughter-in-law who saw me as a burden to be budgeted, not a person to be loved. And I wasn't walking away in defeat. I was walking toward something. I was returning to the version of myself who loved poetry readings, who taught seniors how to email their grandkids, who knew the name of every librarian at the branch downtown. I would call Miss Loretta and see if she still made peach cobbler for church potlucks. I'd sign up to read to third graders again. I'd go to the Thursday line dancing class and not care if my knees popped. I wasn't running. I wasn't hiding. I was remembering. I closed my suitcase and wheeled it to the door. I took one last look at the living room, now a battlefield of spreadsheets and strained voices. I didn't feel sadness, just clarity and relief. No one was home to ask where I was going. And for once, I didn't feel the need to explain. I was going somewhere I was wanted, or maybe just somewhere I could want myself again. Harold used to say, "You're the kind of woman who doesn't need a map. You are the compass." I hadn't understood it then, not fully, but I did now. This wasn't leaving. This was going home to myself. Riverside didn't have chandeliers. No valet parking. No concierge who knew your favorite brand of bottled water. But it had something better. A maple tree outside my second-floor window that caught the afternoon sun just right. The building manager, a soft-spoken woman in a cardigan that looked hand-knit, handed me the keys with a smile. "Unit 2B was last rented by a retired English teacher," she said, pausing as if she were weighing something. "She lived here 13 years. I think you'll fit in just fine." I nodded, cradling the keys like something sacred. The apartment was small, a studio really. White walls chipped at the corners, scuffed floorboards, a kitchen window that stuck when I tried to open it. But it had a balcony, just enough room for a folding chair and a potted plant. The railing was rusted, the air smelled of dust and something faintly floral, like lavender from another life. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't overwhelmed, I was, but because for the first time in years my tears weren't born of disappointment. This place, humble as it was, belonged to no one but me. I unpacked slowly, not because there was much to unpack, only what I had carried in that single suitcase. My wedding album, the delicate blue china teacup with the chip I never minded. Harold's old flannel shirt I slept in when the nights felt too long. And the worn manila envelope that held all the letters he wrote me during his deployments. Placed his library card in the drawer beside my bed. Folded his last note. And for the first time in far too long, I felt like I had stepped into a life that was mine again. "Don't forget who you are, Eleanor. You were brilliant long before you were needed." She had written that line and tucked it inside the pocket of her journal years ago. Tonight, as her fingers traced the worn spine of the wedding album, she placed it gently on the shelf, not in mourning, but in reverence. Then came the teacup. A delicate porcelain thing, white with a thin gold rim, and a chip on the handle from the morning Daniel had knocked it over in his rush. She had kept it anyway. Harold used to say it looked like a cup from a storybook. Eleanor set it on the small wooden shelf above the kitchen sink. It didn't match anything else in the room, but it didn't have to. For the first time in so long, she boiled water just for herself. She made a cup of Earl Grey, sat on the edge of her bed, and cradled the mug between her palms. She just listened. The quiet wasn't empty. It was steady, peaceful, as if the apartment was breathing with her. She wrestled the window open despite the sticky frame, letting in a breeze that carried the scent of river grass and someone's overcooked casserole. The maple leaves whispered in the wind, and she imagined Harold sitting beside her, nodding. "You're doing fine, Eleanor." She reached for an old copy of To the Lighthouse and let her fingers fall open to a random page. Virginia Woolf's words greeted her like an old friend, half forgotten but familiar. Sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains, casting long shadows across the floorboards. In that moment, she wasn't a discarded mother, a widow, or the emergency contact whose phone never rang. She was Eleanor Whitmore, a woman who once loved teaching poetry, who raised a family, who had been broken but not erased, and now she had her own key, her own shelf, her own window to open. It wasn't about luxury. It wasn't about revenge. It was about space, breath, the quiet triumph of choosing herself. She had once been treated like a cost, an obligation, a line item in someone else's ledger. But here, she wasn't extra. She wasn't a burden. She was the homeowner, the one with the lease. Running her fingers along the spines of her books, she paused at leaves of grass and smiled. She had been subtracted from their lives, but here in Riverside, she was finally counted in. Not fancy, but hers. She never thought she would stand behind a microphone again. Not since Harold's memorial, when she sat silent in the front pew, feeling smaller than her black dress. But now, she found herself invited to speak at the Riverside Senior Center's shared wisdom night. The room smelled of brewed coffee and cinnamon rolls. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, occupied by people in their 60s, 70s, even 80s. People who had buried spouses, outlived siblings, and like her, were learning to live with the silence after a life of noise. They handed her a cordless mic and a cup of chamomile tea. She took a slow breath. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore," she began. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of everything carried behind it. "I was a wife for 44 years, a mother for 40, and a placeholder in someone else's life for far too long." The room quieted. Harold, my late husband, used to say, "Eleanor has a heart like a big warm porch. People rest there, but they don't always help maintain it." A few soft chuckles rippled through the crowd. Eleanor smiled faintly. "What I wish I had known earlier," she continued, "is that love without respect becomes duty, and duty without care turns into currency." Her eyes swept over the room. 2 months ago, my son Daniel and his wife Marissa won the lottery, $53 million, and they told me to leave. Gasps broke out, sharp and disbelieving. They said, I was just a burden with a pension, that they needed space, that I should figure something out now that I wasn't useful. Someone whispered, "Lord, have mercy." Eleanor nodded softly. I didn't argue. I packed my bags. And as I left, I smiled and asked them one question. "Did either of you check whose name was on that winning ticket?" The room fell silent. She leaned into the mic, voice calm, almost steady enough to carry Harold's echo within it. "It was mine." A hush swept over the folding chairs. Then a slow clap began. "Not for revenge, not for the money, but for something far more sacred, the reclaiming of her own name. I was never bitter," she said. "Not really, but I did start counting things." Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. She carried everywhere now. She held it up for the room to see, her fingers steady, her heart unshaken. "Don't forget who you are, Eleanor. You were brilliant long before you were needed." She had written that line once and tucked it inside the pocket of her journal. Tonight, as her fingers moved across the worn spine of her wedding album, she set it gently on the shelf, not in mourning, but in reverence. Then came the teacup. White porcelain with a thin gold rim, chipped on the handle from the morning Daniel had knocked it over in his rush. She had kept it anyway. Harold used to say it looked like a cup that belonged in a storybook. Eleanor placed it on the small wooden shelf above the kitchen sink. It didn't match anything else in the room, but it didn't need to, for the first time in so long. She boiled water just for herself. She made a cup of Earl Grey, sat on the edge of her bed, and cradled the mug in her hands. The quiet wasn't empty. It was peaceful, steady, like the apartment was breathing with her. She tugged the sticky window open, and the breeze carried in the scent of river grass and someone's overcooked casserole. The maple leaves whispered, and she imagined Harold sitting beside her, nodding. "You're doing fine, Eleanor." Her fingers found her old copy of To the Lighthouse. She let it fall open to a random page. Virginia Woolf's words greeted her like an old friend, familiar and half forgotten. Sunlight streamed through the gauzy curtains, casting golden lines across the floorboards. In that moment, she wasn't the mother left behind, the widow, the emergency contact who rarely got called. She was Eleanor Whitmore, once a poetry teacher, a woman who raised a family, a woman who had been broken but not erased. Now she had her own key, her own shelf, her own window to open. It wasn't about luxury. It wasn't about revenge. It was about space, about breath, about the quiet triumph of choosing herself. She had once been treated like a cost, an obligation, an entry in someone else's ledger. But here, she wasn't extra. She wasn't a burden. She was the homeowner. Running her fingers across her books, she paused at Leaves of Grass and smiled. She had been subtracted from their lives, but here in Riverside, she was finally counted in. Not fancy, but hers. She never thought she would stand behind a microphone again. Not since Harold's memorial, when she had sat in the front pew feeling smaller than her black dress. But now she found herself at the Riverside Senior Center, invited to speak at the Shared Wisdom Night. The room smelled of brewed coffee and cinnamon rolls. Folding chairs lined up neatly, filled with faces in their 60s, 70s, even 80s. People who had buried spouses, outlived siblings, and like her were learning to live in the silence after lives full of noise. Someone handed her a cordless mic and a cup of chamomile tea. She took a slow breath. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore," she began. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of all she carried. "I was a wife for 44 years, a mother for 40, and a placeholder in someone else's life for far too long." The room hushed. "Harold, my late husband, used to say, Eleanor has a heart like a big warm porch. People rest there, but they don't always help maintain it." A few chuckles broke the silence. Eleanor smiled faintly. "What I wish I'd known earlier," she continued, "is that love without respect becomes duty, and duty without care turns into currency." She paused, scanning the room. 2 months ago, my son Daniel and his wife Marissa won the lottery. $53 million. And they told me to leave. Gasps rippled through the crowd. They said I was a burden with a pension, that they needed space, that I should figure something out now that I wasn't useful. Someone whispered, "God have mercy." Eleanor nodded. I didn't argue. I packed my bags, and as I left, I smiled and asked one question. "Did either of you check whose name is on that winning ticket?" The silence was absolute. She leaned into the microphone, calm. "It was mine." A hush swept through the rows of folding chairs. Then, slowly, clapping began. Not for money, not for revenge, but for something far more sacred, the reclaiming of herself. "I wasn't bitter," she said softly. "But I did start counting things." She pulled a small notebook from her bag, flipping it open. "My emotional ledger," she explained. "Hours spent babysitting, meals cooked, bills paid, miles driven, days missed, birthdays remembered. The number of times I said yes when I wanted to say, 'Please include me.'" Nods filled the room. Someone murmured, "Preach." My daughter-in-law once told me, "We're not running a bank, Eleanor." And I smiled and said, "Then stop treating me like an ATM." This time laughter broke out, laughter edged with understanding. I tell you this because I know some of you have been there. Maybe you still are. I've learned that sometimes your greatest act of courage isn't standing up to others. It's sitting down with yourself and asking, have I counted myself in, or have I let others write me off? The room stilled. I'm not here to tell you how to win the lottery, she added with a wry smile. A ripple of laughter again. But I will tell you this, value doesn't come from being needed. It comes from being known. She closed her notebook gently. Count yourself in before anyone gets the chance to subtract you from their life. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was reverent, like the hush that falls when something new is beginning. As she stepped down, several hands reached out, not because she was frail, but because she was seen. Later that evening, Eleanor was folding her softest blanket, the one Harold had bought for her on their 30th anniversary, when her phone buzzed with a video call. The name on the screen made her breath catch. Emma, her granddaughter. A small yellow heart beside the name. She hadn't heard from Emma since Thanksgiving. After that dinner table fracture, she assumed Daniel and Marissa had erased her from their daughter's world like chalk from a sidewalk. Eleanor stared at the screen, uncertain, until Emma's face appeared. Round cheeks, messy ponytail, a gap where her front tooth had been. "Hi, Grandma," Emma whispered, cautious but smiling. "Mom said not to call, but I missed you." Just those words. And the weight Eleanor had carried for weeks loosened, if only a little. She sank into the couch, holding the phone closer as if she could smooth back Emma's stray strands of hair through the glass. "Oh, sweetheart," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "I've missed you too, more than you'll ever know." Emma glanced over her shoulder, then leaned closer, adjusting the camera. "I drew something for school," she whispered, holding up a sheet of construction paper, crude lines, but unmistakable. A red brick building with a balcony. A tall tree with fiery leaves. A small figure, gray curls, arms open wide. "That's you," Emma grinned. "And that's the maple tree you told me about." Eleanor pressed her fingers gently to the screen, tracing that drawn version of herself, trying to hold it in place forever. Emma watched, her face softening. "I know you moved. Mommy says you went away because you're tired, but I know you didn't leave me." Tears blurred Eleanor's vision. "You're right, my love," she whispered. "I never left you. I never will." Emma beamed, then turned the paper over and wrote something in crooked, earnest handwriting. "Grandma's house." "Do you like it?" she asked. Eleanor couldn't speak. Her throat tightened too much. She pressed her palm to the screen. A silent yes. A silent always. Emma mimicked the gesture, her small hand against hers through the glass. Then footsteps sounded on Emma's side. A door creaked open. Her eyes darted. "I gotta go," she whispered quickly. "But I'll call again, I promise." "Okay, baby. I'll be here." The screen went black. Eleanor stayed on the couch, phone still warm in her hand where Emma's palm had been. Outside the window, the maple trees swayed in the late afternoon light, scattering golden shadows across the floor. Eleanor looked at the little drawing on the screen one more time. For the first time in a long while, she smiled. Not the polite, practiced one she had worn like armor, but a softer smile that rose from somewhere deeper than hurt. They hadn't taken everything from her. Some bonds, the true ones, always found a way back. When adults built walls, children drew windows, and sometimes those windows were enough. The holidays came and went. No one knocked at her door. No packages arrived. No cards. She sat in her riverside apartment and watched snow fall gently onto the iron railing of her narrow balcony. Riverside wasn't grand, but it had peace. And sometimes peace was louder than a house full of voices that never learned how to love without keeping a tally. She had bought a new kettle, blue enamel, like the one Daniel used to reach for when he was small. He loved the whistle, shrill and sudden. He'd clap his hands over his ears and giggle, racing her into the kitchen to see the steam. She still remembered how he liked his tea, too sweet, barely steeped. At her tiny oak desk by the window, Eleanor sat with the maple tree bare outside. Its branches clawed the sky, aching for what they had once held. She opened the desk drawer and pulled out Harold's old pen, the one he used to sign library cards, to jot notes reminding her to pick up marmalade or call the plumber. She uncapped it. The ink still flowed, as though it had been waiting for her. On thick cream stationery, she began to write. Daniel, I hope this finds you well. This isn't a plea or a demand or a guilt trip. It's simply an open door. If you ever feel ready to call me Mom again, not the fun, not the account, but Mom, I'll be here. I don't need an apology. I'm not offering explanations. Just know there's still a mug here with dinosaurs on it. It's chipped, but it's clean. Like my heart. Love, Mom. She read it only once, not to edit, but to feel it. Then she folded it carefully and slid it into a small photo frame. Not the kind meant for display, but the kind meant for safekeeping, discreet and quiet. Behind the letter, she tucked Harold's old library card. Daniel had once called it a magic ticket. One swipe, Mom, and you can unlock any world. Even then, he knew the power of doors that opened differently for readers. She placed the frame on the corner of her bookshelf, not to send, not to deliver, but to exist, just in case. Maybe someday Daniel would visit. Maybe Emma would bring him. Maybe no one would come. The ache that used to consume her had quieted. She no longer needed him to fall on his knees, to cry, to explain where it had gone wrong. What mattered was that her boundary had been drawn with love, not spite. Silence used to terrify her. It had felt like a verdict, a punishment. Now it felt like a garden, quiet but alive, roots threading unseen beneath the soil. That evening, Eleanor brewed herself tea. She reached for the dinosaur mug and smiled. The chip didn't matter. Some things were more precious once they had survived a little damage. She curled into her couch with a book and a crocheted blanket from decades past. Outside, snowflakes drifted slowly, as though reluctant to land too hard on the world. She didn't need a full house. She didn't need gifts, visits, promises of next time. What she needed was already here, in the stillness, in the truth, in the choice to love without begging for love in return. She let herself hope, quietly, that one day someone might pick up that frame, slide out the letter, run their thumb across the card, and remember who she had been when all the noise faded. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of tea and the memory of a little boy's laughter soften the edges of the room. They hadn't come, but her message was there, and it was enough. The morning sunlight came through the blinds in ribbons, soft and golden, wrapping around her shoulders like a shawl. Eleanor stepped onto the balcony with her watering can. The maple tree in its pot was tinged with the faintest amber, leaves clinging a little longer than expected. She had read once that maples hold their color longer than most, as though they'd learned how to stay beautiful even while letting go. She poured water gently into the soil, watching it ripple slowly before sinking down. No rush, just presence. Just care. Behind her, the table waited with quiet companions, a folded napkin, her open book, and a single ceramic teacup, white with tiny violets painted around the rim. An old letter from Harold, his last one, folded gently as if it could still breathe, sat beside the lottery ticket, now pressed between plastic like a museum artifact. I hadn't moved the ticket much. Not out of greed, not out of fear, but because sometimes the things we don't say still hold the loudest meaning. That ticket wasn't about $53 million anymore. It was about all the times I was asked to subtract myself until I finally decided to be whole again. They thought I took the money, But they took something far more precious from me long before that day. They took the tenderness out of my title. Mom became an ATM. Grandma became optional. My presence was a burden to manage. My absence a convenience to arrange. For years I allowed it. I told myself I was just loving them the best I could. But love isn't subtraction, and it's not a ledger. I didn't win because I had the right numbers. I won the moment I chose to stay standing. When I didn't beg for a seat at a table where I was no longer wanted. When I realized I didn't need to fight for their love. I just needed to stop charging interest on mine. That morning, I took a sip from the teacup. It tasted warm, earthy, like something that had steeped a long time to become what it was meant to be. I looked at the ticket, once more, at my name. Eleanor Whitmore, bold and certain in black print. No erasers, no nicknames, no rebranding for convenience. That was the name of a woman who had stitched together a life out of scraps of dignity and hope. Who raised a son, buried a husband, held a trembling granddaughter, and stood in front of an audience to tell her truth. I folded Harold's letter back into its envelope and placed it next to the ticket. Then I whispered, "Only to the maple tree and maybe the wind. They thought I took the money." I smiled. They did. A beat of silence followed, but I knew I had taken something else. I turned back toward the door, left the watering can behind, and gently closed the glass. The screen faded to black. White letters appeared. Love isn't a ledger. I kept the ticket. I kept the name.